The Kerch Bridge, connecting Russia to the Russian-occupied Crimean Peninsula, is one of the most important pieces of infrastructure in the war in Ukraine. It has both road and rail lines. Russia is using road and rail bridges to push troops and supplies to the front line in southern Ukraine. The bridge is also the primary supply route for the important Russian garrison in Crimea. The Kerch Strait, where the bridge is located, is vital for logistically supporting Russian forces in southern Ukraine. Alongside the bridge, the Russian Navy operates a number of military and civilian ships to transport troops and supplies from Russia to Crimea. This key feature of the bridge makes it key to the war and one of the most strategic targets of the Ukrainian offensive. The Kerch Bridge, the personal project of Russian President Vladimir Putin, has a wider significance for the Kremlin besides its military value. Therefore, there are significant forces guarding it. But at some point, before the war in Ukraine ends, Ukrainian forces will try to liberate the Crimean Peninsula. The Kiev leadership has repeatedly stated this. The Ukrainians have set their sights on the Kerch Bridge, the most important connecting route for the Russian army in Crimea. The Kerch Bridge was attacked several times by the Ukrainian army after it became a critical supply route for Russian forces after the start of Moscow's full-scale occupation. The bridge was heavily damaged by Ukrainian attacks in October 2022 and July 2023. On September 27th, Russia allegedly reinforced the defenses around the Kerch Bridge, including by deploying underwater drone traps. However, these measures did not deter the Ukrainian military from attacking the bridge. The Kiev regime has already repeatedly stated that Kerch is the main target. In December 2024, an incredible attack on the Kerch Bridge took place, just as Kiev had promised. Moscow reported that Ukraine had targeted the Kerch Bridge and the Black Sea shipyard in Crimea, and that the attack had been foiled by the naval aviation of Russia's Black Sea Fleet. The Kerch Bridge was later closed on the morning of December 6th, following reports that Ukrainian drones had targeted the area. According to the Crimean Wind Telegram channel, 3 explosions were heard near the Zaliv shipyard in Kerch at intervals of 10 to 20 minutes. Apparently, the Ukrainians had again targeted Russian ships at the Zaliv shipyard near the Kerch Bridge. Local authorities reported that air defense systems were activated in the Kerch Strait. For this reason, vehicle traffic on the Kerch Bridge was temporarily completely stopped. The Russian Defense Ministry announced that its air defense systems shot down a Ukrainian drone over Crimea overnight. The ministry also claimed that the Russian Black Sea Fleet naval aviation destroyed 2 Ukrainian crewless boats in the Black Sea heading towards Crimea. Following these statements, Russian military officials in Crimea became concerned that the Ukrainians may have damaged the Kerch Bridge with their surface attack naval drones. If the Ukrainians had destroyed the bridge, it would have been a very effective victory for the Kiev government. No satisfactory explanation had yet come from the Russian authorities. The Russian-appointed governor of Crimea has not commented on the reported drone strikes. This has been Russia's strategy since the beginning of the war. The Russians usually prefer to remain silent after effective strikes, and adopted the same approach in the recent Ukrainian attack on the Kerch Bridge. Although the Russian authorities are reluctant to bring this to light, this is the 3rd time that the Ukrainians have targeted Kerch and had a major impact on the peninsula. There is now talk that Russia will lose the Kerch Bridge and that the Ukrainians will take control of Crimea. Whether the Ukrainians will succeed is another matter. But given their declared intentions, it is safe to assume that Kiev will launch a large-scale offensive against Russian forces on the peninsula. In such a situation, the situation of the Kerch Bridge will be of key importance. Already this latest attack on Kerch, as well as the spectacular Ukrainian offensives in October 2022 and July 2023, have demonstrated how weak Russia's connection to the peninsula is. General Ben Hodges, former commander of the U.S. Land Forces Europe, believes that Ukrainian defense intelligence could destroy the Crimean bridgehead, but it would require a well-planned operation. Hodges said that long-range Taurus and ATACMS missiles were only able to punch a hole in the bridge, but not enough to completely destroy it. The Crimean Bridge has a lot of steel and concrete, he said, so a lot of explosives of various types would be needed. It would take a well-planned operation to destroy this bridge. A single strike would not be enough to deal with such a crossing. I think if anyone in the world can destroy this bridge, it is General Budanov. I am sure that there are people in the DIU working on a plan to destroy the Crimean Bridge, the U.S. general added. Ukrainian intelligence chief Kirill Budanov said in an interview that the Crimean Bridge, illegally built by the Russian occupation forces, must be demolished. Ukrainian Navy spokesman Dmytro Pletenchuk described how the Kerch Bridge helps destroy enemy weapons depots and Russian air defense. Yes, at the moment, there is no attack on the Kerch Bridge, but for some reason, the entire Russian air defense periodically goes to Crimea. This means that the protection of this object is more important for the Russians than the protection of no less serious objects on the territory of the Russian Federation. You have seen the destruction of weapons depots, which means the destruction of what they rely on to fight directly. It turns out that the Crimean Bridge has a higher priority for them than weapons depots, Pletenchuk emphasized. He recalled that the Crimean Bridge is the only thing that connects the Russian Federation with Crimea, because sea logistics is already dead. After the destruction of the large landing ships Novocherkassk and Caesar Kunikov, the occupiers realized that they could no longer afford to carry military cargo on such ships. Pletenchuk emphasized that there was also an attempt to organize logistics with train ferries, but as a result, only the Kerch Bridge remained. Moreover, after the bridge was damaged as a result of a joint operation by the Security Service of Ukraine and the Ukrainian Navy, the railway does not work. Therefore, the main route remains either land logistics or road logistics over the bridge. It is much more complicated, longer, more expensive, but it works, Pletenchuk said. He confirmed that the Russians have gathered all the weapons they have to protect the bridge. There was information that they were using the S-500 system there. This is the last of the big air defense systems, not to mention the S-300 and S-400 systems, which for some reason also periodically disappear in Crimea. It seems that this main artery remains in place for now, only because the Russians prioritize it in protection, Pletenchuk said. Indeed, despite Russian defenses, the Crimean Bridge may indeed collapse. But the Ukrainian offensive will require hundreds of powerful missiles. The Russian military should not be underestimated here. The Russians still have S-400s that can shoot down missiles. The right thing is to do everything in a mixed attack cycle. That is, ballistics are needed, especially missiles like ATAC-MS, Storm Shadow, and Tauros, which fly at 5,400 kilometers per hour and are very difficult to shoot down. The Ukrainian army also needs to use a combination of cruise missiles and a group of unmanned aerial vehicles. With a strategic plan, the Crimean Bridge can indeed be destroyed, but it needs to be put under fire control so that Russia cannot repair it. If a few sections fall, but this phenomenon is not permanent, they will repair the bridge after a while. But Ukraine will need hundreds of ballistic missiles to take fire control. There was also support for Kiev from the international arena. One of these countries was France. Recent comments by French President Emmanuel Macron have made it clear that Crimea belongs to Ukraine. Recognizing the strategic importance of the peninsula, including for the security of European Union members with Black Sea coasts such as Romania and Bulgaria, Macron stressed that Ukraine's restoration of sovereignty over Crimea is essential for lasting peace in the region. This was in sharp contrast to a move by legislators in the Russian parliament, the Duma. On March 11th, members of the Duma introduced a draft bill aimed at revoking former Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev's 1954 transfer of Crimea from Russia to Ukraine. It is unclear what impact such a law would have on the international legal status of Crimea as part of sovereign Ukrainian territory, but it suggests that there is some tension over Moscow's sovereignty over the peninsula. This tension is even more evident in Putin's statements that he will not recognize red lines if Crimea is seized. Putin and his proxies have threatened on more than one occasion to use nuclear weapons if Russia is in danger of being forced out of Ukraine. These threats may be exaggerated, but putting the nuclear trump card on the table shows how badly Moscow wants to keep Crimea. Russia's recent change in its nuclear doctrine could be seen as a message in this regard. But the Ukrainians are reigniting their plans to destroy the Kerch Bridge and seize control of Crimea with long-range missiles supplied by the West. Russia has already lost its surveillance and targeting capability in the western Black Sea, and its calibers therefore pose no threat to merchant ships moving between Odessa and Romanian waters. In any case, things have moved on. Crimea itself is now being squeezed, and not only the naval base in Sevastopol, but everywhere on the peninsula could be the target of Ukrainian attacks with long-range missiles provided by the West. The U.S. supplied ATACMS ballistic missiles, and the fact that President Biden finally lifted the ban on using them to hit targets in Russia in a completely legitimate manner under Article 51 of the UN Charter show that now nowhere in Crimea is safe. The possibility of the Ukrainians using the Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles is another major issue that is causing tremors on the Kerch Bridge. Let's take the possibility of an ATACMS missile attack. If you remember, the Russians had increased the use of ro-ro ferries in Kerch, allowing more supplies to flow through the strait, but the ferries have now been hit by ATACMS and are out of service. There are only two main arteries holding Crimea together, the new railway and the downsized Kerch Bridge, but both are within ATACMS range. It is difficult to destroy a railroad that has been laid on flat terrain for a long time, which can be repaired fairly quickly, but ATACMS is a missile that is capable of doing it. In addition to ATACMS, the use of Storm Shadow missiles in attacks in Crimea is one of the nightmares of the Russian military authorities on the peninsula. The Ukrainians could use these missiles again to attack Crimea or directly destroy the Kerch Bridge. And the Russians would have a hard time responding to these possible Ukrainian attacks with fighter jets, let alone air defense systems. This is because Russia has deployed a large part of its strategic bomber fleet in Crimea in different areas for fear of possible Ukrainian airstrikes. For a long time, several Russian fighter jets have been deployed at the Belbek base in Crimea. These included Su-27 fighters, including modifications such as the Su-27SM and Su-27UB, and the Su-27M2, which is part of the 38th Fighter Aviation Regiment. Belbek also served as a base for strategic MiG-31s, some of which could be equipped with Kinjal hypersonic missiles. However, most of these fighter jets are now allegedly no longer in Crimea. According to reports, these jets in Crimea have been redeployed to the Olenia base in the Murmansk region, along with aircraft from Engels. The Russian withdrawal of fighter jets from Crimea makes it easier for Ukrainians to target the peninsula and the Kerch Bridge with airstrikes. Referring to this ease, Ukrainian military officials are also toughening their statements about Crimea and Kerch. For example, Oleksiy Nezhpapa, commander of the Navy of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, promised to demolish an important bridge connecting occupied Crimea to Russia. Retired U.S. General Ben Hodges, former commander of NATO's Land Forces Europe, agrees. The general's remarks emphasized the importance of the ATACMS, Storm Shadow, and Scalp missiles in the Ukrainian military inventory for the destruction of the Crimean Bridge. Storm Shadow and Scalp are long-range missiles developed jointly by the United Kingdom and France and designed to target fixed targets, including well-protected locations such as bunkers, in adverse weather conditions, and at any time of the day. With a range of more than 250 kilometers, they were developed in the late 1990s and early 2000s, mainly for use by the UK Royal Air Force and the French Air Force. They are also characterized by their ability to hit fixed, hardened targets with extreme precision, using a powerful tandem warhead and an advanced guidance system based on a combination of GPS and terrain reference data to reach the target even in bad weather conditions. Launchable from a variety of aircraft platforms, including the Eurofighter Typhoon, Saab Gripen, Tornado GR4, Mirage 2000, and Rafale. The Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles pose a threat to the Crimean Peninsula. France's deployment of Mirage 2000 fighter jets to Ukraine will expand the use of Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles. This will significantly increase Russian concerns over both Crimea and the Kerch Bridge. Ukrainian shipments of Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles are capable of destroying Russian munitions management and storage facilities in Crimea, surface ships, and submarines in ports, bridges, and other high-value strategic targets. The Russian side is well aware of the situation and expects that the Ukrainians will use these missiles to attack various military structures in Crimea, in particular the Kerch Bridge. But the Ukrainian strategy of destroying the Kerch Bridge does not look so easy. There are, of course, fundamental reasons for this. First of all, the Kerch Bridge is a structurally sound causeway designed to withstand significant pressure. Its massive structure, with piles penetrating the ground by as much as 100 meters, allows it to withstand a variety of forces, including strong winds, earthquakes, and even explosions. Secondly, the bridge's remote location plays an important role in its survival. Although Storm Shadow missiles can reach this bridge, distance can reduce the severity of attacks. Third, the Russians have stepped up their defense efforts against Kerch in recognition of Ukraine's strategic preference for it. While the bridge serves as a critical supply route for the Russian military, it is also known as President Putin's pet project. Putin is therefore resorting to effective defense methods to secure the bridge. Russia began deploying barges on the southern side of the bridge in early May to protect the structure and the shipping channel from future Ukrainian Navy drone attacks. According to Western intelligence, the previously installed barriers had been damaged by storms. By June, protective measures had been increased to include additional barges and floating boom defenses running parallel to the bridge. The latest new images show a significant increase in the number of barges protecting the bridge. The new barriers are not the only protective measure Russia has taken to protect the bridge. Recently released satellite images show two Pantsir air defense systems near the structure. Experts suggest that the towers for these systems were built between August 18 and 23. Their construction suggests that Russia is not only concerned about naval threats to the bridge from below, but also wants to protect it from above. The fourth reason that makes it difficult for the Ukrainians to destroy Kerch lies in the valuable intelligence that the bridge provides to Ukraine and Western countries. By monitoring the bridge, the Ukrainian armed forces and intelligence teams can track the flow of equipment and reinforcements from Russia to southern Ukraine and closely monitor Moscow's actions. Because of this advantageous situation, the Ukrainians may face serious difficulties in their plans to completely eliminate Kerch. But the fact that the bridge serves as an escape route for Russian troops, allowing Russian forces to easily retreat instead of being cornered and desperately resisting in Crimea, increases the likelihood of an attack on Kerch. Therefore, the Ukrainians could eliminate the Kerch Bridge with Storm Shadow or Scalp missiles, bypassing the advantage of having intelligence on the logistical situation of the Russian army. Of course, we should not forget some political considerations that prevent the Ukrainians from striking Kerch. The bridge could be used by Ukraine as a negotiating lever. Given the significant financial and personal connections with President Putin, the destruction of the bridge could be an important tool in future peace negotiations. In other words, the Kerch Bridge could appeal to Mr. Putin's ego and potentially give Kiev a strategic advantage. Kiev could therefore play a long-term game instead of trying to demolish the bridge altogether. Ukrainians may also realize that control over the bridge could also be valuable in a post-war scenario. But it is well known that Ukrainians no longer have the patience to endure this process. Kiev believes that the Kerch Bridge must be completely eliminated in order to halt Putin's invasion efforts and to more easily expel Russian forces from Crimea. Therefore, the role of the Kerch Bridge as leverage is becoming less important for Kiev. The Ukrainians are now thinking directly about demolishing the bridge. This is causing the Russians to tighten their defense posture in the region. In addition to Western long-range missiles, the Russians are also concerned about the Ukrainians using drones and surface unmanned boats to attack Kerch. Therefore, Russia, as we mentioned, has resorted to a number of methods to mitigate the dangers. The Russians believe that barges can prevent drone and naval drone attacks on the bridge. The reason for considering these barges is to reduce the approach angle for Ukrainian unmanned surface vehicles, or USVs. The Russians will achieve this to some extent, but steering something like the Magura V5 USV around or between them is not in itself a challenge for a system capable of killing against moving targets at sea. The barges may also have an anti-USV pendant and possibly even people with guns on them. This can help defeat USVs on their own, but does nothing to an ATACMS attack. It would be equally ineffective against a missile equipped with the compression masts, anti-compression technology, frequency hopping, and inertial navigation backup systems that barges are reported to have for this. The Ukrainians can show both creativity and synchronicity in their attacks on such important targets as barges. For example, a storm shadow on one of the barges followed by a USV wave through the gap would overwhelm all defenses there, which could lead to the collapse of bridges. A simultaneous attack on the road rail line would mean that all supplies for the Dnipro front and the various bases in Crimea would come in trucks over an overloaded road network under the hammer of Ukrainian army guns and missiles. This would make it easier to repair railroads than bridges, but would likely exacerbate the supply problems on the peninsula and further reduce Russia's ability to use it as a base. So there could be a double win in this case. Some have even begun to wonder whether this is the right time for Ukraine to launch some kind of amphibious landing. The Ukrainians have made determined efforts to cross the Dnipro River, but the classic use of an amphibious assault is to encircle the enemy. A landing in Crimea would eliminate the need to attack prepared defenses, as in the current front line. Westerners would see this as inconceivable, because the Ukrainians, quite literally, lack the naval resources needed for an amphibious assault. But if you remember, the Ukrainians did it once. Special naval commando units made an amphibious landing on the Crimean coast and destroyed the radar systems there. Perhaps Crimea does not need Ukrainian troops on the ground at all. Kiev could use its drones and long-range missiles for a victory there, and then wait for Moscow to pay the heavy bill. In sum, we cannot talk about full control of the Crimean Peninsula for Russia. Likewise, the Kerch Bridge is no longer a main supply line that Russia can fully protect. All this is in line with Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky's statements that the war will start and end in Crimea. This expected end suggests a very different direction for Russia. If Zelensky's plans come true, the Ukrainians could end this war forever. Thank you for choosing us.